Nazis' first efforts at mass murder in Europe was their Euthanasia program that started in January 1940 within Germany and in a less structured sense in Poland from September 1939. For the Nazis, the Jewish question, which they answered with what they called the final solution, or the murder of as many of Europe's Jews as they could get their hands on, was part of a more ambitious project of racial cleansing and resettlement, the General Plan for the East, created by Himmler and his staff from 1941 to 1944. And this envisaged the deaths of from 30 to 48 million people. It's quite a number, isn't it? 30 to 48 million people by starvation and disease. And many of these were meant to be Slavs, and of those, most of them were meant to be Russians, and 14 million Russians did die. Although it would be wrong to reduce the mass murders of the Euthanasia program and the Holocaust to just one aspect of a larger extermination plan, we need to understand the bigger context of Nazis' global ambitions to reorder the races and the populations of the entire globe. This was their attempt to create a racial utopia. And it would have happened, quite possibly, if they'd won the war. When you think of when the war turned with the defeats in Russia, if the Nazis had won in Russia, things would have been very, very different. So this was their overarching aspiration. Indeed, in a really weird way, it sort of mirrored the concept of the Jews as a chosen people, because the Nazis really believed that they had a worldwide mission as the dominant and superior race to take control of the entire world, and that they were chosen to do this by virtue of their superiority. And don't forget, they were already imperial masters. They had a foreign empire, or a small one. They were quite latecomers to the African scramble for colonies, but they had in eastern and southern Africa, they had colonies which they administered with a brutality that has led some historians to see it also as a precursor of the Holocaust. The German administration of their African colonies provided a bed of experience that would shape the Third Reich. Now, Raoul Hilberg, the great historian, Jewish historian, has concluded that the Euthanasia program was conceptual as well as a technological and administrative prefiguration of the final solution in the death camps. So what were the connections conceptually? Well, they were both based on this pseudo-scientific ideology, a cocktail of racial hygiene, social Darwinism, eugenics, racial anti-Semitism, that motivated the Nazis' regime's assault on those whom they identified as a threat to the hereditary health of the German people. In this endeavor, they very importantly were aided by the entire medical, scientific academic elite. And Germany had developed in that way, they were so much ahead of most other countries in Europe. And they had, before World War II, they had more Nobel laureates than any other country. Now, anthropological theories from the early 19th century supported sort of a racial imperialism, which the Germans believed they had this, nearly divine mandate, because the Germanic peoples who had, for nearly 2,000 years before, had covered much of what is now today Germany and parts of Poland, and quite a large part of Eastern Europe. They believed that that gave them the right to expand, and they had this sort of concept that they were going to take over from west to east. And it was a kind of mirror image of the manifest destiny in America that said, the dominant white race in the eastern part of the States could expand to the west and do whatever they liked in order to take control of it. And interestingly enough, Hitler himself was a great fan of the Wild West and tales of what went on there. There was a very popular author called Karl May who wrote these fantastic adventure stories, popular stories that Hitler gobbled up. In fact, he kept his entire collection in his bedroom. There's great shelves full of the stuff. And of course, the point was that the indigenous peoples, the American Indians, were subjected by the white supreme race. But they were going east to west, and Hitler was going west to east. Now, Charles Darwin's original work that identified natural selection as the mechanism of evolution was hijacked to lend an air of scientific legitimacy to the development of selective breeding of human beings, or social Darwinism. Now, this wasn't a new idea, because there are various utopias that were proposed, going all the way back to Plato, that were based on selective breeding of human beings. And Darwin's cousin, Galton, carried this on along with the zoologist, German zoologist Ernst Haeckel. They developed this concept and applied it to human beings. And interestingly, Galton said that healthy parents, that's members of the educated middle class, should have lots of children, and that members of the genetically undesirable be excluded from society through what he called emigration to can't say anywhere. So there was no proposal of what happened to these people. They were just meant to disappear. And don't forget, that was very much what the Nazis did. The first persecution of the Jews under them was to try to just remove them from Germany, and emigration was very much the first plan. So his theories became very respectable and were taken up in respectable scientific circles. And one such respectable physician, William Schallmeyer, produced a 1903 prize-winning publication that proposed that those of lesser heredity value be sterilized, isolated first and then sterilized. So we move from isolation or expulsion, that is emigration, to sterilization, which is also replicated in the persecution of the Jews. A permanent severing of connection with the community and its future, and that's the point. It's the total eradication from your community of these people. Now, eugenics, which is the phrase that Galton coined, spread through Europe and North America with a strongly individualistic flavor. But in Germany, it tended to be expressed collectively through state intervention. Now, in post-World War I Germany, fear was a potent motivator in eugenics and racial hygiene debates, because the fear of the educated middle classes was that they were going to be overwhelmed by the proliferating poor. And to put it crudely, I suppose, welfare was obstructing the function of natural selection. So people, instead of being left to starve and die, were beginning to be cared for by the state. And Germany was really the first welfare state, although it was very limited. After the war, in the 1920s, during the war, the whole debate sort of was shelved, because there are obviously many more important things going on. But also, the necessity was to have a large population. You needed cannon fodder, so you weren't going to eliminate anyone. But after the war, the qualitative aspect of genetic heritage became very important, because there was the perception, which was quite true, was that huge numbers of the best and bravest of Germans, potentially procreating males, had been killed. And therefore the gene pool was becoming very unbalanced. And as early as 1923, it became publicly known that surgeons had been illegally sterilizing the mentally handicapped in the Zwickau district. So by July 1932, the Prussian government had formulated a Reich sterilization law, But before it could be even debated, Hitler had come to power. Now there seems to be a moral shift after the war. There is a huge amount of unrest, there were strikes, there was the carnage of the war, there was the catastrophe of losing it, there was the chaotic and violent unrest. It was exacerbated by mass unemployment and at one stage by hyperinflation, which was just, horrendous. And so that really resulted in this moral shift. And as early as 1920, at the second annual conference of the German Psychiatric Association, its chairman, Karl Bonhoeffer, said the following: "It could almost seem as if we have witnessed a change in the concept of humanity. I simply mean that we were forced by the terrible exigencies of war to ascribe a different value to the life of the individual than was the case before, and that in the years of starvation during the war, we had to get used to watching our patients die of malnutrition in vast numbers." And this was true because there was a deliberate policy, government policy, that removed food from the hospitals, particularly from anything to do with a psychiatric or mental institution or asylum, and gave it to those people whom they deemed to be productive. So there's also the danger of going too far, the danger that the self-sacrificing subordination of the strong to the needs of the helpless and ill, which lies at the heart of any true concern for the sick, will give ground to the demand of the healthy to live. Now, the classic definition of euthanasia up to this point had been received and respected, and that is mercy killing with the patient's consent and helping them to die if they were incurably ill or suffering intolerable pain or they had a terminal illness. Now, an Austrian psychologist, Alfred Jost, adds to this. He wrote a book called, in the early, I think 1902 or 3, called The Right to Die, and in it he adds to the right of the ill person to choose death. He adds to this the concept of negative human worth, and that is the negative burden that falls upon the family or community by the incurably ill. And he was the one who was such a direct influence that in 1920 we have the publication of The Permission for the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life by Karl Binding, a leading specialist in jurisprudence, and Alfred Hoch, a professor of psychiatry. And their manifesto went beyond the arguments for sterilization and called for laws to permit the killing of those deemed unworthy of life, or as they were also called, useless eaters. Now, Binding and Hoch's book intensified the already widespread and lively public debate. And what's interesting here is the fact that during this, it was a very publicly debated issue, but no theologian or physician or lawyer got up and said, this is totally unacceptable. And to me that is indicative that the whole population of the Weimar Republic really was quite accepting of this concept of selective breeding, which was made possible in part by racial extinction. And this is the very change in humanity which Bonhoeffer referred to. Now, the shift in morality identified by him was reflected in the change in the nature of anti-Semitism from its historical and religious base. Amongst all other ills, such as the stab in the back fiction, that there was a Jewish conspiracy, an international one, but present in Germany, where the Jews were responsible for ending the war by betraying the army. Germany's greatest enemy, the Jews, were deemed responsible for what was their attempt to damage the hereditary purity of the German race. One example, the writer Arthur Dinter, and he was really not a very respectable sort of fellow, but he did get published along with a lot of other people who were writing equal rubbish. He published a book telling the tale of a blonde, blue-eyed German woman who is seduced by a Jew, and although she manages to escape from him, her children, whom she has with the husband that she eventually marries. She does marry another blonde, blue-eyed Aryan. But her children are born with black hair and black eyes, and they're totally Jewish-looking, thus proving that the sacred German blood could be permanently corrupted by a casual sexual encounter with a Jew. Now, the thing that's I find fascinating about the sort of head Nazis is they actually genuinely believe this stuff. Things like that they actually believe. Now, I'm not saying that excuses the choices they made, far from it, but we can scarcely conceive of that today, 70 years on. It's unbelievable to us, but they actually genuinely believed it. Now, not all eugenicists were anti-Semites. It was Houston Stewart Chamberlain who can be seen as responsible for fusing racial hygiene and social Darwinism with anti-Semitism. And according to him, the Jews were responsible for absolutely everything wrong. Now a lot of other people thought that too. They were responsible for all the ills of the world: liberalism, socialism, communism, capitalism, two mutually exclusive concepts. And all adverse aspects of secularism and modernism. Now, as I say, this was nothing new, but Chamberlain's twist to it was that you were Jewish because you were born Jewish, and up until the concept of racial identities, if you were Jewish or any other religion, you could convert to another religion, and that put an end to your identity. But Chamberlain's take on it, and with lots of followers and supporters, is that converting to Christianity or baptism would offer no escape. Changing religion was meaningless, as Jewish identity was by race. Born a Jew, die a Jew. Now, the attack on handicapped patients in state hospitals and nursing homes began in 1933 with forced sterilization, made legal on the 14th of July under the name of Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases. And you should hear it in German. I wish I could say it for you. Under Clause 12 of this law, what were considered hereditary diseases were extended to include congenital feeble-mindedness. And this is the most elastic category, because it was anything that the Germans decided it meant, but specifically what was then known as Mongolism, what is today Down syndrome. Schizophrenia, manic depression, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness and deafness, serious physical deformities. Now, hereditary health courts were set up to decide on who was sterilized. Attempts to lend an air of scientific objectivity in the selection process used a questionnaire as a form of intelligence test. So you were asked quite normal questions such as your name and your age, your date of birth, what day is it today, where did you go to school, who is Bismarck, simple arithmetic, what is Christmas. But there's one question that might have given difficulty. What is the current form of government in Germany? If you answered correctly that it was a terrorist dictatorship, I don't think they would have waited to take you to a hospital to inject you with something. That would have been the end. Anyway, between 1933 and the start of the war, about 300,000 Germans were compulsorily sterilized. As early as 1935, Hitler revealed his plan to begin euthanasia if there was war. The point being that in the enormous goings-on during a war, and in the huge movements of people and the concern for what was going on in the actual military campaigns, no one was really going to notice if a few people were bussed around Germany and killed. So from 1935, he was determined that this was going to happen. In May 1939, Hitler instructed his attending physician, Karl Brandt, to prepare for the killing of mentally ill infants and children up to the age of 3. Now, the first child, and what enabled Hitler to get going, really gave him the impetus to start the program, was there was a couple who had a very severely deformed and handicapped baby. It was known as the Nauer baby. And they requested that he would be killed. And don't forget, of course, at this stage, euthanasia is totally illegal. You would be prosecuted, you would be put in jail if you either killed someone or enabled them to die. So Hitler says, yes, he will do it, or he will make it possible to happen. So he appoints the physician, Brandt, and Philip Buhler, who's the head of the KDF, Hitler's private chancellery, or the chancellery of the Führer, the Führer, a party, not a government agency, to be his plenipotentiaries in charge of the children's euthanasia. Now, Buhler in turn assigns the job of organising the killings to Office 2 of the KDF, whose head was a man called Victor Brack. Now, the important point here is the appointment of Brandt and Buhler was confirmed by a note actually signed by Hitler, saying that that's what he was telling them that they should do. They should organise the killing. It was backdated to the 1st of September because of the war. And the choice of the KDF as the implementing agency was important because if a government agency, such as the Ministry of the Interior, was in charge, too many people would be involved and secrecy would be lost. In order to further safeguard secrecy, the organisers made up a fictitious agency to camouflage the KDF, which they called the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Severe Hereditary Ailments, another mouthful in German. The Reich Committee, for short. This agency existed only on paper. Its address was a post office box and personnel used aliases in written communications. On the 18th of August, the Interior Ministry circulated a decree to doctors and midwives saying they had to report any newborns who showed any signs of mental or physical handicap. A one-page form was filled out for each child, sent to a panel of 3 medical experts, pediatricians Cattell, Heinze, and Wenzler, who put a plus next to the name if they were to enter the euthanasia program, a minus if they were to be not included in the killing, and a question mark if they had to take it further for further evaluation. But let me stress that these evaluations were very perfunctory. The form had no room to put a proper written evaluation on it. It was just a whitewash, really. Eventually, at least 22 killing wards were established in state hospitals. Now, the first killing ward, established in Brandenburg-Gurten State Hospital near Berlin, announced on the 1st of July 1940 its creation. And it continued the deception about the true nature of the intent of the program, because the public health officers were told the following. Under expert medical supervision, the psychiatric children's ward at Gurten near Brandenburg on the Havel will provide all available therapeutic interventions made possible by recent scientific discoveries. One of the methods of killing was starvation, which had been used during the war, but the favoured method was use of medication, either morphine, scopolamine, or the barbiturates, variable lumina. The advantage of this method for secret killing was, of course, that these were drugs that were in use, widely available in hospitals and from doctors, and you didn't, if there was an autopsy, you'd see nothing but maybe an overdose of a drug in common usage. They wouldn't have been poisoned or in any other way clearly murdered. The Reich Committee children were killed because they did not fit into the projected future German society. But to gain control over these children, the committee and the physicians used lies and threats to gain the cooperation of the parents. If the children were already in an institution, then they didn't have to apply to the parents for permission. But remember, they're trying to keep this all under wraps, so they've got to get permission from the parents. Now, most parents, with the best of intentions, thought, fantastic, if someone can do something to help my child, that's fine, I'll sign. Some of them didn't want to, for various reasons. They had heard rumours which were already spreading, or the Reich Committee diagnosis didn't match that of the family's physicians, or they simply didn't want to part with their children, which is also understandable. And this is where things really diverge from what happened during the Holocaust. Because you see, the handicapped population in Germany were part of families, they were part of communities. You would see little Hans being pushed in his wheelchair down to the corner shop. People knew them, And they couldn't just suddenly disappear. They certainly couldn't be shot, and they had to keep it as low-key as possible. With the Jews, it was a different matter, because they were being removed. Before they were deported, they were removed from German society, so you didn't see them really much anyway. And who was going to stand up for them? But certainly for your neighbor's kid, or your own child, or someone that you even knew as a friend of a friend, you weren't just going to stay quiet indefinitely. Many of the children killed were not suffering from incurable diseases or severely disabling condition, but only had mild disabilities and learning difficulties or behavioral problems. Because most of the records were lost of the killing wards in the hospitals, we only have an estimate of how many were killed in World War II, and it was 5,000, 5,000 to 6,000. The next stage was the euthanasia, the killing of the adults. In the summer of 1939, Hitler instructed Dr. Leonardo Conti, State Secretary of Health in the Interior Ministry, to organize a plan for adult euthanasia. The number identified by the steering group to be killed was around 70,000 adults, and the method was also chosen in early 1940, and that was gas. As part of ad hoc measures in occupied Poland, after the invasion between the end of September and the 1st of November, about 4,000 mental patients in asylums in the area of Bromberg were shot by the SS. A further group of patients from asylums in Pomerania were taken into the forests for execution and discreet disposal. And finally, in December 1939 and early January, SS Special Commando under Herbert Lange gassed 1,558 inmates from Polish asylums in specially adapted vans. Most of them had the logo Kaiser's Coffee Company. He went on, Lange, to have the dubious distinction of replicating the gassing of the Polish asylum patients by carrying out the first mass murder of the Jews at Chelmno, where from December 41 for 15 months his unit gassed 145,000 Jews. Now, very shortly after the killings in Poland, the official euthanasia program in Germany began, with secrecy still paramount. As the KDF offices were too small and to handle a much larger operation, they set up yet another organization, the Reich Association of Asylums, and from April 1940 it was located at a villa at Tiergartenstrasse number 4, from which the program took its code name, Action T4. Now, the same team of Brandt, Buhler, Linden, and Brack were in charge, but this larger operation meant there had to be recruitment of a lot more medical staff, a lot more helpers. Don't forget, these bodies were being burned, they were being gassed and then burnt in crematoria, just as with the death camps. You had to have people handling them. There were maintenance men. There was a huge support staff that was needed. Even the transport was run by a phony company, Gekrat, the Community Patients Transport Service Limited, which used postal vans, because they felt they'd be relatively unobtrusive in rural areas, to shuttle the patients from whatever hospital or asylum they had been in to a holding center often, and then to the killing center. And this was also the procedure with the murder in the death camps of the Jews and those others who were murdered there with them. There were 6 of these specially adapted asylums: Grafenegg, Hadamar, Bernburg, Brandenburg, Hartheim, and Sonnenstein, all of which were modified by the SS, so they had to build special chambers, the gas chambers, and all the other things that had to be modified, and the medical and nursing staff then moved in. Now, there's substantial evidence that the patients, again as with the Holocaust killings, knew or at least strongly suspected their fate, and some had to be sedated or even restrained in straitjackets. As with Holocaust victims, the selected patients upon arrival were given a perfunctory glance by medical staff, They were then photographed and then killed in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. All of this is very familiar to you, I'm sure, because this was what happened. They went on to develop this as well in the death camps. The corpses were then burned in crematoria, whose putrid smoke was one factor that made continued secrecy impossible. Also, as at the death camps, the clothing, personal effects, and gold from patients' teeth was removed by the handlers of the corpses. The next thing that happened was a letter reporting the safe arrival of the patient, from where they had come, from the institution they'd been in, was sent to the family. And a mass-produced letter of condolence was then sent out to the family, but nearly always with a good interval of time to ward off suspicion. But it also meant that the asylum could continue to collect maintenance money, either from the relatives or from the state, by fraudulently claiming the patients were still alive. And this actually made a huge contribution to the Nazi regime's cash flow. They got a lot of money out of it. The cause of death was given as some condition that left no visible sign, or something from which the patient was known already to suffer. And records were falsified to conceal the large numbers of deaths in one place. And they also had groups of couriers who motorbiked ashes, urns of ashes, to different post offices in various towns. So there wasn't this complete massive posting of urns holding people's ashes. And of course, by the way, that was another deceit. You were meant to receive the ashes of your deceased son, daughter, father, whatever. And of course, they just had this massive pit which they shoveled into urns, so you didn't know whose ashes you were getting. And one of the ways that the secrecy was broached was that you might have a daughter or a mother, a female relative who had died in the asylum, and you received an urn. You had a male relative, and you looked at the ashes, and up popped some hairpins. So, that didn't bear out, did it really, that it was your loved one who was there. The cause of death was given as some conditions that they already suffered from. So that it didn't leave any visible sign. The killing of handicapped Jews in institutions initially was handled in the same way as all the others. But in April of 1940, Herbert Linden, Ministry of the Interior health official, who was involved in all of this, and who became the civil servant in charge of adult euthanasia, asked local health authorities to submit the names of all Jewish patients in mental hospitals or asylums in their area. They were transferred as groups to various assembly centers and from thence to the gas chambers in the killing asylums in Germany. But as camouflage, Grekat told inquirers that the Jewish transports had been sent to an asylum in Chelm, or Cholm, in the Lublin district of the general government, and to aid the deception, you would receive a death certificate from postmarked Chelm. Despite the precautions, the sheer number of patients being gassed and cremated inevitably led to mistakes that gave the game away, such as already referred to, finding hairpins in the ashes of your male family member. The staff were permanently drunk, nearly, most of them, all of the time, and hardly surprising, you might say. So they used to go out to the local pub, and everything soon started to get out. Persistent relatives also pushed the authorities to discover the truth, and occasionally the staff of an asylum that was delivering their patients to the killing center would try to protect them, and there were actually brawls between the staff of the asylum and the transport personnel who were trying to protect the patients. And in one case, a local mayor traced the letters that spelt the name Hartmann in the dust on the side of one of the transport vans, the name of a notorious murderer, as a local crowd gathered to watch. The euthanasia program had become an open secret. As the secret leaked out, families contacted clergymen and members of the judiciary. One judge, Lothar Krasik, even instituted criminal proceedings against Buhler for murder. The judge took early retirement. The courts themselves had questions about the deaths of individuals who were their wards. Now, the Church's passivity, despite occasional protests from individuals like Pastor Paul Brown, was conspicuous, as both Catholic and Protestant denominations actually ran their own mental institutions and asylums. They were actively collaborating with the government. They had to be. It couldn't have happened without them helping. The well-known protest of Bishop Galen, the Bishop of Munster, given in a sermon on the 3rd of August 1941, did provoke other clergy to protest. These lesser clergy were sent off to concentration camps, but the brave bishop himself was left unmolested. On the 24th of August, Hitler officially, as a result of all the uproar, it was turning into a public uproar about the killings, halted the euthanasia program officially. But probably the speculation, it wasn't so much about public opinion, because although he initially did matter to him, it was getting to the point where presumably it wasn't such a big deal. But it was the quota that they'd originally identified. They had their quota of 70,000+, and they reached it. So we think that's possibly why it stopped. Now, although mass murder by gassing in the center stopped with Hitler's August order, the killing of mental patients continued and even increased. It turned into something called wild euthanasia, where the individual hospitals, not the killing centers, the 6 killing centers, but just the ordinary state institutions, were told they should kill their own patients in their own hospitals. And they did that by injections and pills, usually. In early 1941, Himmler and Bühler agreed to use T4 asylums to take sick or frail prisoners from concentration camps for special treatment. T4 physicians toured the camps to examine and choose prisoners from those pre-selected by the SS. Communists and Jews were the preferred selectees. From letters and diaries, we know that the visiting T4 doctors enjoyed the food in the officers' mess, and they really did eat an awful lot of sausage. They also, we know from letters and diaries, we know that the visiting T4 doctors made unambiguous reference to the purpose of their inspections of the camps. They were there to choose people to take back to Germany to murder. Up to 30,000 prisoners were killed in the T4 asylums, and this operation was codenamed Action 14F13, because that was the name of the file which they used to put all the information into. Now, Hitler's stop order on killing by gassing and the subsequent decentralization of the killing meant that there was a pool of experienced personnel to carry out the mass murders of the final solution. Some medical personnel were relocated to Russia to serve the army, but many T4 operatives were seconded to Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka to run the technical side of the extermination camps, drawing on their expertise in both. Here we go. So they were called on because of their expertise to help with the killings, and I can't remember the names of the actual people, but there were 3 or 4 people who ended up as commandants at Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor, who had been in charge of some of the asylums. A lot of the ordinary foot soldiers, the helpers, the people who shoveled up the ashes and everything, they also went. There were more than 90 operatives from the T4 program who were transferred to the camps. And really, the main point is that both operations, both killing operations, the euthanasia and of course the Holocaust itself, were part of this bigger picture of trying to create the racial utopia that the Germans felt they could only do by protecting and cleansing the German blood from any pollutants, that is, from inside, in the sense of within the German population, the non-Jewish population, the handicapped people who were going to pass on undesirable traits to the future, and of course the Jews, who were the arch enemy of all time, the enemy of all enemies, the eternal Jew. Thank you.